This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of daughter no one worries about. She is the one who does not slam doors. She does not call attention to herself. She does not become the family scandal, the obvious problem, the child people whisper about over coffee after church or at a backyard cookout. She is the daughter who learns how to read a room before she learns how to read herself. The daughter who notices when her father's jaw tightens, when her mother's voice gets softer, when the air in the house changes by a single degree and suddenly everything feels dangerous, even though nobody says the word dangerous out loud. She becomes fluent in moods before she ever becomes fluent in her own needs. And because she is not the loud one, not the rebellious one, not the one falling apart in public, no one sees what is actually happening to her. She is disappearing. Not dramatically. Not in a way that alarms the neighbors. Not in a way that leaves evidence. She disappears by becoming pleasant. By becoming helpful. By becoming easy. By becoming the girl who understands that love in her house has conditions, even if no one is honest enough to name them. This kind of loss is almost impossible to explain to people who only recognize pain when it arrives screaming. Because some wounds do not scream. Some wounds sit at the dinner table with perfect posture. Some wounds say I'm fine before anyone asks. Some wounds make straight A's, help with the dishes, smile for family photos, and grow into women who look completely functional while carrying an emptiness so old it feels like personality. That is the daughter I want to talk about. If this kind of story speaks to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It helps support this work and helps me keep making videos that tell the truth about the quiet, invisible realities so many women have carried alone for far too long. I think one of the most heartbreaking things about being raised by a passive, emotionally unavailable mother is that it can take me decades to understand what happened. If my mother had been openly cruel, maybe the story would have been simpler. If she had been obviously neglectful, maybe I would have had language earlier. If she had been explosive, rejecting, or blatantly cold, maybe I would not have spent half my life defending her while quietly bleeding from what she could not give. But a passive, emotionally unavailable mother often does not look like the mother people expect me to grieve. She may look kind. She may look gentle. She may look tired, devoted, modest, respectable. She may be the woman everyone praises for being patient, for keeping the family together, for not complaining, for standing by her husband, for always showing up with the casserole, the birthday card, the polite smile, the right words for everyone except herself. She may even love me in the only way she knows how. And still, I grow up starving. That is where the confusion begins. Because I do not grow up in the absence of a mother. I grow up in the presence of a woman who is always there and never truly with me. A woman who may know how I like my sandwiches cut, what size shoes I wear, which classes I take, when my dentist appointment is, but who cannot meet me in the places that matter most. She cannot hold my feelings if they threaten the emotional order of the home. She cannot stand beside my truth if doing so means risking tension with the man she has built her life around. She cannot protect my inner world because she abandoned her own a long time ago. So I learned something very early, long before I can say it in words: there is no safe place for my full self here. Not the angry self. Not the grieving self. Not the confused self. Not the self that wants to ask, why does he get to speak like that? Not the self that notices my mother shrinking and feels terrified by what womanhood might mean if this is the model. Not the self that wants to be comforted without becoming a burden. Instead, I become observant. Extremely observant. I notice what gets my mother's attention and what does not. I notice which feelings make her uncomfortable. I notice how quickly she changes the subject when something real comes too close to the surface. I notice how the family protects male moods and edits female pain. I notice that my mother can endure what should never have been normalized. And without meaning to, I begin to understand that if I want connection, I will have to become manageable. That is how some daughters become good. Not good in the moral sense. Good in the family system sense. Easy to parent. Easy to overlook. Easy to rely on. Easy to praise because they ask for so little. People love to compliment girls like this. They call us mature, independent, old souls. So helpful. So grounded. So self-sufficient. But there is something almost unbearable about being admired for the very adaptations that cost me my voice. Because what looks like maturity from the outside is often just fear made beautiful. I was not necessarily born low maintenance. I may have been trained into it. I may have learned that the fastest way to keep whatever scraps of peace existed in the house was to need less, say less, feel less, reveal less. I may have learned that being loved required a kind of elegance under pressure, a kind of emotional neatness, a willingness to swallow disappointment before it became inconvenient for someone else. And that lesson does not stay in childhood. It follows me. It follows me into my friendships, where I become the woman who listens deeply and reveals selectively. The woman who knows how to show up for everyone else while struggling to say, actually, I'm not okay. It follows me into my work, where I become competent, dependable, impossible to ignore professionally and strangely easy to ignore emotionally. It follows me into my relationships, where I may confuse being chosen with being cherished, where I may tolerate distance because distance feels familiar, where I may call loneliness normal simply because it resembles home. It follows me into my body, which carries more than I admit. Tight shoulders. A clenched jaw. Exhaustion that no weekend fully touches. The private craving to be left alone, not because I hate people, but because being around people has so often meant managing myself around their needs. And maybe the saddest part is this: for a long time, I may not even know I am disappearing. I may think I am succeeding. After all, I am functioning. I am responsible. I am useful. I am composed. I know how to get things done. I know how to keep the day moving. I know how to survive disappointment without making a scene. But there comes a moment, for many women, when survival stops feeling noble and starts feeling eerie. A moment late at night, maybe after everyone has gone to bed, when the house is finally quiet and there is no one left to tend to, no text left to answer, no lunch left to pack, no conversation left to smooth over. And in that stillness, I come face to face with something I have been outrunning for years. I have become a woman other people can count on, but I do not know if I have ever fully learned how to belong to myself. That realization can feel shocking, even if it arrives softly, because I may have built an entire life around functioning well inside emotional deprivation. I may have become so skilled at being steady that no one knows how lonely I am. So practiced at appearing fine that even I forget there is grief underneath the polish. So loyal to being the calm one, the capable one, the understanding one, that I have mistaken my own erasure for love. That is what makes this kind of story so devastating. There may be no single dramatic event to point to. No one monstrous scene. No obvious evidence. Only 1,000 moments in which I learned that my mother could not quite come with me into the truth. A father's harshness excused. A difficult conversation shut down. A hurt redirected. A need minimized. A child praised for handling things on her own. A daughter silently realizing that her mother's energy belongs to the emotional weather of the house, not to her. And what does that daughter become? She becomes highly capable, highly intuitive, highly restrained. She may become funny, successful, organized, nurturing, strong. She may become the woman everyone depends on. But inside, there is often a question she cannot shake. What would my life have felt like if I had been deeply met? Not managed. Not praised. Not fed and clothed and scheduled and supervised. Met. Seen when I was hurting. Protected when something was wrong. Encouraged to trust what I felt. Taught that my voice did not destroy love. Shown that a woman could stay connected to herself in the presence of tension. That kind of mothering changes everything. And when I do not receive it, I do what daughters have always done. I adapt. Beautifully, intelligently, heartbreakingly. I become the daughter who learned to disappear so well that by adulthood, my absence from myself looks almost elegant. That is why this conversation matters. Because some women are not unraveling in obvious ways. They are living inside old adaptations that once kept them safe and now keep them lonely. They are doing fine in every way the world respects and quietly lost in the ways that matter most. They are raising children, building careers, surviving marriages, caring for aging parents, keeping promises, paying bills, carrying invisible loads, and all the while feeling a strange distance between the life they are living and the self they were meant to become. If that distance feels familiar, I want to say this carefully. I do not think that feeling came from nowhere. I do not think it means I am broken. I do not think it means I am ungrateful. I do not think it means I am too sensitive, too needy, too serious, or impossible to satisfy. I think it may mean that I learned to disappear in a house where peace was valued more than truth, where my mother's passivity taught me to abandon myself before anyone else could do it for me. And once I see that, really see it, I cannot unsee it. Because the mystery is no longer whether something happened. The mystery is how much of my life has been built around surviving it. And that is where this story begins. What a passive, emotionally unavailable mother really teaches. What a passive, emotionally unavailable mother teaches is almost never announced directly. There is no formal lesson. No speech. No chapter title. No moment where she sits me down and says, "This is how a woman survives by slowly leaving herself." If anything, the teaching is subtle enough to be mistaken for normal life. It arrives through repetition, through atmosphere, through the choreography of the household, through what gets interrupted, what gets softened, what gets denied, what gets postponed, and what is never allowed to become fully real. That is why this kind of mothering can shape me so powerfully while remaining difficult to explain. The lessons are not taught in language first. They are taught in nervous system terms, in timing, in expression, in what happens to the room when truth gets too close. A passive, emotionally unavailable mother teaches me that peace and honesty are not the same thing, but I may spend years confusing them. She teaches me that a quiet house is not necessarily a safe house. That a family can look stable from the outside while the emotional truth inside it is constantly being rearranged to protect the most fragile or powerful person in the room. She teaches me that conflict is something to avoid, not something to move through with integrity. She teaches me that if a truth threatens the structure of the family, then the truth is the problem. This matters because a daughter does not only learn from what her mother says. I learn from what my mother cannot bear. If my mother cannot bear tension, I learn to edit myself before tension arrives. If she cannot bear anger, I learn to mistrust anger, even when anger is the most honest thing in the room. If she cannot bear disappointment, I learn to swallow it quickly and translate it into patience. If she cannot bear confrontation, I learn to treat my own discomfort as something embarrassing that should be privately managed before it inconveniences other people. Over time, this becomes a philosophy of womanhood, even if nobody ever calls it that. I learn that being a good woman means absorbing. Absorbing inconsistency. Absorbing insensitivity. Absorbing other people's moods. Absorbing the unfinished emotional business of the household. I learn that maturity means being the one who can understand everyone. The one who can interpret the father's harshness, excuse the husband's silence, explain the brother's temper, soften the child's disappointment, and all the while remain strangely unpracticed in naming what is happening inside me. That is one of the deepest distortions a passive, emotionally unavailable mother passes on. She teaches me empathy without self-protection, sensitivity without boundaries, endurance without discernment. She may appear gentle, but what she often transmits is a dangerous flexibility of self. A willingness to bend around what should have been named. A loyalty to smoothing over what should have interrupted the entire emotional order of the family. And because she is often not openly cruel, I may not recognize how formative this is. Cruelty is easier to identify. Passivity hides in plain sight. It can look like politeness, restraint, grace, loyalty, decency. It can even look spiritual. It can sound like keeping the peace, taking the high road, being patient, letting things go, not making a mountain out of a molehill. But what if those phrases are not signs of wisdom? What if, in some families, they become elegant containers for fear? A passive, emotionally unavailable mother teaches me that the appearance of stability is more important than the substance of truth. She teaches me that a woman can look composed while betraying herself every day. She teaches me that keeping a marriage intact may matter more than protecting a daughter's reality. She teaches me that preserving the emotional comfort of a man can become a family value, even when nobody is honest enough to say that out loud. So I learn hierarchy. Not official hierarchy. Emotional hierarchy. Whose moods matter most. Whose reactions shape the room. Whose discomfort must be avoided. Whose truth can be delayed. Whose pain gets interpreted. Whose voice comes second. This is the kind of teaching that follows me long after childhood. It becomes the hidden architecture of my adult relationships. Because once I have learned, at home, that some people are allowed to have impact and others are expected to have restraint, I do not simply forget that lesson when I become a woman. I carry it into friendships, work, marriage, parenting, and even into the private way I speak to myself. A passive, emotionally unavailable mother also teaches me that women can be physically responsible and emotionally absent at the same time. This is one of the most confusing truths for daughters like me. My mother may have packed lunches, washed clothes, remembered appointments, paid attention to practical details, and still failed to provide the thing I most needed, emotional attunement. She may have been dutiful without being available. She may have cared for my life while remaining unreachable inside it. That distinction changes everything, because it means I can grow up technically cared for and still inwardly unmothered. It means I may have been fed without being deeply known. I may have been supervised without being emotionally protected. I may have been praised without being understood. I may have been raised by a woman who could do all the visible parts of motherhood while remaining absent from the invisible ones. And when that happens, I learn not to expect too much from intimacy. That lesson is devastating in adulthood. It means I may settle for relationships that are functional but not emotionally nourishing. I may interpret consistency as closeness, shared logistics as intimacy, and reliability as love, even when something in me remains untouched. Not because I lack depth. Because I was trained in a version of care that handled life efficiently while leaving the inner world largely untranslated. A passive, emotionally unavailable mother teaches me that female pain should be made palatable before it is expressed. So I learn to soften my language. I learn to package discomfort carefully. I learn to present hurt in a way that does not threaten anybody. I learn to speak in disclaimers. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Those phrases do not come from nowhere. They come from years of learning that truth must be made socially acceptable before it will be tolerated. They come from watching a mother who could not speak plainly because plain speech would have required a self she was not allowed to inhabit. She also teaches me something profound about helplessness. Not necessarily through words, but through posture. Through resignation. Through the way she adapts to what should have provoked action. Through the way she tolerates, delays, excuses, and waits. She may not say, "I have no power," but if she continually behaves as though her life is being determined by other people's moods, choices, and limitations, then that is what I absorb. I absorb a female template in which endurance looks more available than agency. I absorb the idea that change is costly, confrontation is dangerous, and self-advocacy may not be worth the relational price. I absorb the possibility that feeling trapped is just part of being a woman. This is how daughters grow up and later find themselves unable to explain why they remain in situations that do not fit them. Why leaving feels unthinkable even when staying feels deadening. Why self-assertion feels morally contaminated. Why clarity feels harsher than it is. Why saying "I can't do this anymore" feels like a greater violation than years of quiet self-erasure. Another thing a passive, emotionally unavailable mother teaches me is that external regulation can replace inner grounding. If my mother's emotional state was constantly shaped by whoever she was around, I learned that moods are contagious and identity is porous. I learned to orient outward. I learned to scan, adjust, anticipate. I learned that relationships are not places where two grounded people meet. They are places where one person often organizes herself around another. That is a dangerous model because it leaves me underdeveloped in the very area I need most as an adult: inner authority. Without inner authority, I can be accomplished and still easily shaken. I can be intelligent and still unsure. I can make money, raise children, manage crises, lead teams, and still not know how to remain anchored in myself when someone disapproves of me. Because the early lesson was not, "Feel what you feel and stay with yourself." The early lesson was, "Notice what others feel and organize accordingly." What makes this especially painful is that many passive, emotionally unavailable mothers reward the exact patterns that later wound me. If I am low maintenance, I am praised. If I handle things alone, I am admired. If I do not create friction, I am easier to love. If I become useful, thoughtful, and emotionally edited, I fit the system beautifully. So the false self gets reinforced while the deeper self remains underdeveloped. Then, years later, I may find myself admired for qualities that were built in part from deprivation. My competence. My calm. My self-sufficiency. My diplomacy. My ability to carry a lot without complaint. The world may reward all of it, not realizing that some of those traits were formed in adaptation to emotional absence. That is why healing requires more than insight. It requires a re-examination of what I was taught to call good. Was I truly peaceful, or simply afraid of tension? Was I truly patient, or had I learned to wait endlessly in places where truth was being delayed? Was I truly independent, or had I stopped expecting anyone to meet me? Was I truly understanding, or had I become skilled at abandoning my own perspective to preserve connection? These are painful questions, but they matter. Because what a passive, emotionally unavailable mother really teaches is not simply passivity. She teaches me how to disappear in socially acceptable ways. How to remain loyal to relationships that require my silence. How to confuse emotional starvation with maturity. How to become so well behaved inside other people's limitations that I barely notice what it is costing me. And yet the deepest tragedy is not only what she taught. It is what she did not teach. She did not teach me that discomfort can be information. She did not teach me that conflict can be navigated without catastrophe. She did not teach me that love can survive truth. She did not teach me that a woman's inner life deserves protection. She did not teach me that boundaries are an expression of dignity. She did not teach me that emotional honesty is not cruelty. She did not teach me that I can stay connected to myself even when the room changes temperature. So much of adult life becomes an attempt to learn, slowly and often painfully, what should have been modeled long ago. And perhaps that is the clearest way to say it. A passive, emotionally unavailable mother does not simply fail to give warmth. She leaves a daughter without a working map for how to be fully present, truthful, and self-connected inside love. That absence echoes. Not always loudly, but everywhere. The invisible rules I inherited. The invisible rules I inherited were never written down, and that is part of why they took so long to recognize. No one gathered me in the kitchen and explained the terms of belonging. No one said, "Here is what this family will require from you if you want to stay connected, if you want to be loved, if you want to avoid becoming a problem." The rules lived in pauses, in glances, in what happened after certain truths were spoken, in what happened when I showed too much feeling, in how quickly the room shifted when reality came too close to the surface. I learned them the way children learn weather. Not through theory. Through exposure. And because they were invisible, I mistook them for my personality. I thought I was naturally agreeable. I thought I was simply mature. I thought I was independent, considerate, calm under pressure, easy to be around. I did not yet understand that some of what looked like character had been shaped by adaptation. I had been trained, quietly and thoroughly, to survive by reading what could not be said and obeying what was never named. One of the first invisible rules was this: do not make things harder than they already are. This rule sounds almost noble until I look at what it did to me. It taught me to measure the worth of my feelings by the inconvenience they might cause. Before I asked for comfort, I assessed the room. Before I brought up pain, I considered everyone else's capacity. Before I spoke honestly, I weighed whether the truth might create tension that no one else would know how to hold. I learned to become my own filter, my own editor, my own emotional customs officer, inspecting every feeling before it was allowed to enter the world. That kind of self-surveillance does not disappear in adulthood. It matures with me. It becomes the reason I overthink emails, rehearse conversations in the shower, soften the language of my hurt before I speak it, and lie awake replaying interactions that seemed small on the outside but left me vaguely ashamed, vaguely erased, vaguely wrong. It becomes the reason I can sense friction from across a room and immediately begin rearranging myself in response. Another rule: if someone else is upset, I should adjust first. This is how a daughter becomes deeply responsive and quietly estranged from herself. I learned to register other people's moods with astonishing speed. I could feel tension before anyone named it. I could hear the edge in a voice, notice the temperature of a silence, sense when a room had tilted emotionally. And because I learned that managing those shifts was part of staying safe and staying connected, I became highly skilled at self-modification. I made myself gentler, quieter, easier, more useful, more pleasing, less exacting, less visible. The tragedy of this rule is not only that it exhausts me. It also trains me to treat other people's emotional states as more authoritative than my own. If someone is disappointed, I feel responsible. If someone is irritated, I become alert. If someone withdraws, I begin searching myself for the error. My first instinct is not always, "What do I feel about this?" It is often, "How do I reduce the risk here? How do I restore steadiness? How do I make this easier to survive?" That is not peace. That is vigilance in a polite dress. Another invisible rule I inherited was, do not ask for too much. This rule enters a woman's life so early and so quietly that she may never realize how much it governs her. It shapes what I request, what I confess, what I admit I need. It affects romance, friendship, work, marriage, even motherhood. I do not want to be excessive. I do not want to be the one who asks for reassurance twice. I do not want to need tenderness too openly. I do not want to ask for help if help seems reluctant. I do not want to ask for clarity if clarity might force someone into honesty. So I learn to work with fragments, with hints, with partial care, with almosts. And then, over time, I call myself low maintenance. But some women are not low maintenance by nature. Some women were simply taught that desire is dangerous when it becomes visible. So I become the woman who says, whatever you want is fine, even when I do have a preference. The woman who does not send the second text. The woman who picks the restaurant everybody else likes, accepts the family plan that leaves her tired, says yes to the extra task at work, and then feels irrationally resentful later because her life has once again been built around the comfort of other people. Another rule: strong feelings should be translated before they are spoken. This one has a particularly quiet violence to it because it creates emotional distance inside the self. If I learned that raw feeling is unwelcome, I become fluent in emotional revision. I turn anger into patience, grief into tiredness, disappointment into understanding, loneliness into busyness. I do not necessarily lie. I edit. I present the more acceptable version, the more civilized version, the version that can enter the room without requiring too much from anyone else. That is how a woman can lose touch with the precise language of her own interior life. She can know she is off without knowing that what she is actually feeling is abandoned. She can call herself irritable when she is heartbroken. She can say she is overwhelmed when she is furious. She can say she is stressed when she is living in a relationship that keeps asking her to swallow herself in order to remain lovable. Another rule: being useful is safer than being fully known. This rule is one of the hardest to break because it is so thoroughly rewarded. If I am useful, people value me. If I remember, organize, anticipate, prepare, soothe, fix, and carry, I become indispensable. And for daughters who grew up emotionally undermirrored, usefulness can feel like a reliable path to belonging. If I cannot be deeply met, at least I can be needed. If I cannot count on emotional attunement, at least I can secure my place by being competent. So I become the dependable one. The one who knows the deadlines, the allergies, the birthdays, the emotional preferences of everybody in the room. I become the woman who can handle the logistics of life beautifully. But usefulness has a hidden cost when it becomes identity. It allows people to lean on me without ever really asking who I am beneath my function. It encourages relationships in which my labor is visible but my inner life remains peripheral. It leaves me praised for reliability while quietly starving for tenderness. That starvation is difficult to explain, especially in midlife. Because from the outside, I may look deeply established, responsible, accomplished, capable. Yet inside I may feel like I am living in a beautifully managed distance from myself. Everyone knows what I do. Fewer people know what it costs me. Everyone knows they can count on me. Fewer people know how rarely I feel emotionally held without earning it first. Another rule: asking for help is weakness, or at the very least, risk. This rule can create women who look impressively self-sufficient and feel quietly stranded. I handle things alone because handling things alone feels cleaner than exposing a need that may be dismissed, minimized, delayed, or met with reluctance. I would rather carry too much than feel the humiliation of not being fully met. So I become a lone island with excellent manners. I make the appointment, solve the problem, move the boxes, navigate the paperwork, absorb the stress, and tell myself I prefer it this way. But preference and conditioning are not always the same thing. Some of what I call independence may actually be old disappointment made practical. Some of what I call strength may be an ancient refusal to put my need in untrustworthy hands. These invisible rules also shape the smallest, most ordinary moments. They determine how long I stay on the phone when I want to hang up, how often I say sorry before offering a thought, how quickly I explain myself when setting a limit, how much discomfort I absorb before I believe I have earned the right to name it, how often I give the benefit of the doubt to people who have repeatedly shown me who they are, how many times I tell myself, it's probably nothing, when my body has already registered that it is not nothing. That is another hidden cost of these rules. They teach me to distrust early signals, to wait for more proof, to endure longer than necessary, to ask for less certainty than I need, to remain in ambiguity because ambiguity is familiar, to call this caution, maturity, compassion. Sometimes it is all three. But sometimes it is simply what happens when a woman is shaped by an environment where direct emotional truth was too destabilizing to be welcomed. There is also a social elegance to these inherited rules, which makes them especially hard to challenge. They can look like femininity, good manners, emotional intelligence, generosity, poise. I may be praised for being diplomatic when I am actually self-erasing. Praised for being calm when I am actually disconnected. Praised for being understanding when I have simply learned to stand farther from my own perspective than is healthy. The world often rewards women for disappearing gracefully. That reward can make the pattern feel virtuous, even when it is slowly hollowing me out. By the time I notice the loneliness beneath it, the rules can feel ancient. Not like choices, but like gravity. They govern how I move through a marriage, how I parent, how I work, how I rest, how I receive love, how I interpret silence, how I tolerate distance, how I respond when someone is displeased with me. They make me an expert in accommodation and a novice in self-reference. And perhaps that is the deepest injury of all. Not simply that I inherited rules that kept me small, but that I inherited rules that made smallness feel moral. That made accommodation feel like goodness. That made invisibility feel like maturity. That made overfunctioning feel like love. So when I begin to examine these invisible rules, I am not just reviewing habits. I am revisiting an entire private code of womanhood. A code that taught me to be careful before being real, useful before being known, acceptable before being honest, self-contained before being comforted. No wonder so many women reach the middle of life exhausted in ways they cannot fully explain. No wonder they feel lonely in relationships that technically function. No wonder they are praised for strength while quietly longing for a place where they do not have to be so beautifully disciplined all the time. The rules may be invisible, but their consequences are not. They are written into marriages, friendships, work habits, parenting styles, bodies, and inner lives. They are written into the way I apologize, the way I defer, the way I delay, the way I endure, the way I disappear politely in rooms where a more self-connected woman might have remained fully present. To see these rules clearly is painful. It means admitting that some of what I have called goodness was fear, some of what I have called patience was self-silencing, and some of what I have called independence was an old decision never to ask for more than the people around me were prepared to give. But clarity, even painful clarity, is cleaner than confusion. At least confusion asks me to keep disappearing. Clarity does not. Why I became so good at enduring the wrong things. I did not become skilled at enduring the wrong things by accident. I became skilled at it because endurance was one of the earliest forms of belonging available to me. It was the quiet art I learned before I ever understood that it was an art at all. It looked like patience. It sounded like maturity. It earned approval, or at least it prevented disruption. And because it kept life moving, because it allowed me to stay connected inside emotional conditions that did not fully nourish me, I mistook it for strength. That confusion shaped more of my life than I knew. There is a certain kind of woman who can tolerate almost anything as long as it does not become too visibly unbearable. She can live beside emotional distance for years. She can normalize chronic disappointment if it arrives in familiar tones. She can keep showing up in relationships that leave her lonely, in jobs that drain her, in family roles that consume her, because nothing is dramatic enough to justify leaving, resisting, or telling the truth at full volume. She can function so well inside deprivation that deprivation begins to look like adulthood. I know that woman because I have been her. I know what it is to stay calm in situations that should have alarmed me. I know what it is to lower the standard of what I call love, what I call respect, what I call enough. I know what it is to keep translating my own pain into gentler language so I can continue tolerating it. Not because I enjoy suffering. Not because I lack intelligence. But because what feels intolerable to one woman can feel strangely familiar to another, especially if familiarity was built inside a home where emotional hunger wore the face of normal life. That is one of the most dangerous consequences of being raised by a passive, emotionally unavailable mother. I do not always register the wrong thing as wrong soon enough. I register it as manageable. I register it as disappointing, tiring, difficult, unfortunate, complicated, but not necessarily as disqualifying. My threshold gets distorted. My sense of what should stop me, offend me, protect me, or move me to action becomes unusually flexible. I can keep going in conditions that ask too much of me because somewhere deep in my system, too much feels recognizable. So I may remain in a marriage that is not openly cruel but quietly starving. A marriage where the logistics work better than the intimacy. A marriage where two adults coordinate calendars, pay bills, attend holidays, discuss groceries, and sleep beside each other while the emotional air between them grows thinner every year. Nothing in it looks catastrophic enough to outsiders. There are no shattered dishes, no police calls, no dramatic betrayals. There is simply the ache of not being met, not being fully seen, not being emotionally accompanied in the life I am living. And because I was not taught to treat that ache as meaningful, I may turn it back on myself. Maybe I am expecting too much. Maybe this is just what marriage becomes. Maybe I need to be more patient. Maybe I am too sensitive to the ordinary disappointments of adulthood. Those sentences can steal years from a woman. Not because they are always false, but because they can become a shelter for avoidance. They can become the polite language of self-betrayal. They can allow me to remain in spaces where my spirit is slowly dimming simply because no single event seems severe enough to authorize my honesty. The same pattern can appear in friendship. I may become the woman who is always available, always understanding, always the safe place where others bring their pain, their confusion, their emergencies, their disappointments. I may be the friend who remembers details, who checks in, who listens deeply, who makes room. But when the direction reverses, when I need witness instead of usefulness, the relationship may suddenly feel sparse. I may realize, sometimes after years, that I have built entire bonds around being emotionally competent for others while receiving only fragments in return. And still, instead of stepping back quickly, I may endure. I may explain. I may wait. I may keep investing in one-sidedness because I have been conditioned to believe that being the steadier one is evidence of love. Work can become another place where this endurance looks almost admirable. Especially in American life, where women are rewarded for being efficient, polished, emotionally intelligent, and endlessly capable, I may become exceptionally good at carrying more than is reasonable. I may over-prepare, over-perform, over-function. I may become indispensable in the office because being needed has always felt safer than being fully known. I may tolerate dismissive leadership, unfair expectations, subtle disrespect, or chronic overextension because I know how to survive on approval mixed with depletion. I know how to tell myself, Just get through this quarter. Just make it to the next review. Just be grateful. Just do not make it harder than it already is. That is the language of endurance. It sounds responsible. It sounds adult. It sounds like the voice of someone who can handle a lot. But it can also be the voice of a woman so accustomed to carrying what should have been shared that she no longer notices the violence of her own overextension. The body usually notices first. The body knows when I have been enduring too long. It knows in the clench of the jaw, the shallow breath, the sleep that never restores, the Sunday dread, the fatigue that settles into my bones, the strange emotional flatness that appears after years of being the competent one. It knows in the tension headaches, the back tightness, the private stress around food, control, and rest. It knows in how hard it is for me to relax when no one needs anything from me because I have built so much of my identity around responding. When the body begins to speak this way, it is not betraying me. It is often telling the truth I have postponed. Perfectionism grows here too, but I do not think perfectionism is always vanity or ambition. Often it is a survival response. If emotional life felt unstable, then getting things right can become a way to create order. If being composed and competent reduced friction, then excellence becomes more than a preference. It becomes protection. I may work hard not only because I care, but because mistakes feel disproportionately dangerous. I may chase precision because some part of me still believes that if I am good enough, useful enough, prepared enough, graceful enough, I can avoid the discomfort of disapproval, conflict, rejection, or abandonment. But perfectionism has a cruel bargain built into it. It asks me to give more and more while never letting me arrive. It tells me that relief is always one accomplishment away, one cleaner performance away, one better version of myself away. And because my deeper wound was never really about performance to begin with, performance cannot heal it. It can only distract me from it. This is why I can become outwardly accomplished and inwardly unconvinced. I can build a respectable life and still feel strangely fragile in the face of criticism. I can be praised by others and still feel like a fraud in private. I can do excellent work and remain haunted by the suspicion that I am still somehow not enough. Not because the evidence supports that fear, but because my self-worth was never built on solid internal ground. It was built, at least in part, on adaptation, approval, and how successfully I managed myself in response to other people. People-pleasing also deepens in this territory, though it often takes a very polished form. It is not always obvious or desperate. Sometimes it looks refined, mature, even generous. I know how to anticipate what others want. I know how to make things easier. I know how to maintain flow. I know how to prevent awkwardness, how to absorb the extra labor, how to say yes with a calm face. But beneath that polished responsiveness is often a woman who has not been taught that her own no matters as much as someone else's comfort. So I endure. I endure the casual comment that stings more than I admit. I endure the partner who takes my steadiness for granted. I endure the family role that treats me like infrastructure. I endure the work culture that rewards overextension. I endure the holiday obligation, the friendship imbalance, the low-grade disrespect, the marriage that no longer nourishes, the invisible emotional labor that fills every corner of my day. And because I endure so gracefully, people assume I am fine. That may be one of the loneliest parts. A woman who is very good at enduring often becomes almost illegible in her suffering. She is too composed to alarm anyone. Too responsible to collapse publicly. Too practiced in minimizing her own pain to give it language while it is happening. By the time the truth reaches her lips, it may sound quiet and simple, but it has usually been gathering for years. There is often anger under all of this, though not always the kind people expect. Not theatrical anger. Not always explosive anger. Sometimes it is a slow, buried heat. A private resentment. A weariness so deep it turns ordinary inconveniences into tipping points. The sink full of dishes. The thoughtless comment. The unanswered text. The assumption that I will handle it. None of these things create the whole feeling. They merely brush against an older wound. I have spent too much of my life absorbing what should have been addressed. That realization can be devastating because it forces me to see endurance differently. What I once called patience may have been fear of rupture. What I once called loyalty may have been terror of disappointing people whose approval I still unconsciously sought. What I once called being strong may have been a very sophisticated inability to leave what was hurting me. And yet I do not want to judge the woman who learned to survive this way. She did not choose these patterns from freedom. She was shaped into them. Endurance once served a purpose. It preserved connection where direct truth felt risky. It created order where emotional clarity was missing. It allowed her to remain loved, or at least tolerated, inside structures that did not welcome her full self. But what protected me once can become the very thing that keeps me exiled from my own life now. That is the heartbreak of it. Not simply that I endured the wrong things, but that I became so good at it that it began to look like identity. It began to look like who I am instead of what I learned to do. A woman can lose decades that way. Not in obvious misery, but in a kind of honorable depletion. She can keep functioning, keep giving, keep staying, keep explaining, keep waiting for something to improve that she has never fully named. And one day she may find herself standing in the middle of an ordinary life that no longer feels livable in the same old way, not because it is dramatic, but because she can no longer ignore how much of herself it has required. That moment is not weakness. It is not selfishness. It is not a failure of gratitude. It is what happens when the truth finally outweighs the training. And for a woman who has spent years enduring the wrong things, that shift can feel less like rebellion than recognition. A painful, overdue recognition that some forms of strength were never meant to become a permanent address. The mother-daughter tension no one talks about. There is a kind of tension between a mother and daughter that almost no one knows how to talk about, because from the outside it does not look dramatic enough to deserve language. It does not fit the stories people understand easily. There is no obvious villain, no clean moral structure, no simple sentence that explains why I could love my mother, ache for her, feel sorry for her, and still carry a deep and private wound because of who she could not be with me. This is the tension that grows in homes where the mother is passive, emotionally unavailable, and more complicated than anyone wants to admit. What makes this tension so disorienting is that it rarely comes in a form that other people recognize. If my mother had been openly cruel, perhaps I would have had permission earlier to trust my own pain. If she had been clearly rejecting, perhaps the grief would have had a more visible shape. But when a mother is passive, soft-spoken, dutiful, religious, polite, outwardly selfless, and generally seen by others as a good woman, then the daughter lives inside a contradiction that can split her in two. I may experience harm that nobody else can see. I may carry a sorrow that sounds petty when I try to describe it. I may know that something in the relationship has always cut me, while also knowing that the woman who cut me looked, to the rest of the world, harmless. That is one of the loneliest emotional realities a daughter can live with. Because the wound does not just come from what happened between us. It also comes from the fact that I often cannot get anyone to understand it. People hear my mother was passive and imagine softness. They hear emotionally unavailable and think distance, maybe coldness, maybe distraction. But what they often miss is the emotional distortion that can exist beneath a mother's passivity. A passive mother is not always a peaceful mother. Sometimes she is a woman full of unspoken rage, disappointment, resentment, envy, grief, humiliation, and powerlessness, but with no mature place to put any of it. So it leaks. It leaks sideways. It leaks into tone. Into withdrawal. Into little comments that sound harmless if you were not there for the whole history. Into subtle disapproval. Into the kind of silence that is not empty at all, but full of accusation. Into moments when I am somehow made to feel too much, too visible, too pleased with myself, too free, too alive. That is where the mother-daughter tension becomes almost impossible to explain. Because I am not just dealing with a mother who failed to protect me or failed to meet me emotionally. I may also be dealing with a mother who cannot bear something in me. And daughters know when this is true, even when they spend years trying to explain it away. I know when my joy lands wrong. I know when my success changes the room. I know when my independence creates a chill I am not supposed to mention. I know when my mother's support has a thinness to it, when her smile does not fully open, when her questions are practical instead of warm, when she makes a moment smaller than it was because something about my expansion unsettles her. This is the taboo no one prepares women to name. Sometimes a mother can be triggered by her daughter's aliveness. Not always because she is evil. Not always because she consciously wants to harm. But because a daughter's becoming can expose the places where a mother stopped becoming herself. If my mother never felt free in her own life, my freedom may disturb her. If she never learned to honor her own preferences, my self-definition may look selfish to her. If she stayed too long, swallowed too much, adapted too completely, then watching me reach for something more may stir not admiration, but old grief she has spent years burying. And buried grief has a way of hardening into reactions that do not make sense on the surface. That is how a daughter ends up feeling the unbearable thing she does not want to say out loud. I think my mother resented something in me. Even writing that feels disloyal. Because daughters are not supposed to think that. We are allowed to say our mothers were overwhelmed, depressed, stressed, limited, from another generation. Doing their best. We are allowed to feel compassion. We are allowed to excuse. We are allowed to contextualize. But many daughters are never given language for the possibility that the mother's passivity also concealed rivalry, emotional possession, or a subtle resistance to the daughter becoming more whole than she ever permitted herself to be. So I silence that truth. I make it smaller. I tell myself I am imagining it. I call it miscommunication. I call it sensitivity. I call it one bad day, one awkward comment, one strange holiday, one cold reaction, one odd tone on the phone. But when those moments accumulate over decades, they begin to form a pattern that is hard to ignore. A mother who goes flat during my milestones. A mother who becomes cool when I make a bold choice. A mother who acts supportive in public but withholding in private. A mother who can sympathize with my pain more easily than she can celebrate my freedom. That pattern leaves a daughter with a very specific kind of emotional confusion. Because I may still love her deeply. I may still understand where her sadness comes from. I may still feel protective of her because I can see how trapped she has been by her own history, her marriage, her fear, her dependence, her inability to become emotionally separate from the people who shaped her. So when anger rises in me, guilt rises with it. That is part of what makes this bond so exhausting. I am not simply angry. I am angry and compassionate. Hurt and protective. Resentful and loyal. I want to say, why didn't you choose me? Why didn't you protect me? Why didn't you stand beside the truth when I needed you? And at the same time, I can see the frightened girl still living inside her. I can see the emotional immaturity, the dependence, the old wounds, the fear of conflict, the life built around adaptation. I can see that she was never fully free enough inside herself to mother me from a place of grounded strength. So my grief gets tangled. It does not move cleanly. It catches on pity. It catches on duty. It catches on the old habit of making her understandable before I allow myself to feel the full weight of what it was like to be her daughter. That tangled grief can follow a woman well into midlife. A daughter can be 48, 55, 62, and still feel 12 years old after a phone call with her mother. Still feel the old confusion. Still leave the conversation with a heaviness she cannot quite explain. Still feel how quickly she regresses into managing tone, editing truth, softening edges, and hoping for a warmth that does not quite arrive. That is because the child in the daughter never fully stopped waiting. She waits for the uncomplicated approval, the simple delight. The response that says, without chill or ambivalence, "I see you. I am glad for you. I am not threatened by your becoming." For many daughters of passive, emotionally unavailable mothers, that moment never comes in the way it should. And still, I wait. That waiting shapes more than I realize. It shapes how much of my life I narrate to my mother. How much I hide. How much I dilute good news before I share it. How much I brace before calling. How quickly I hear criticism even in neutral remarks. How deeply I still long, despite everything, to be received by her in a way that feels emotionally clean. There is another layer to this tension that remains difficult to name. A passive mother may appear powerless in one direction and quietly powerful in another. She may seem helpless with a husband, passive with authority, compliant in public, and yet she can exert deep control over a daughter through guilt, fragility, disappointment, or emotional withholding. She does not need to shout. She may not even need to criticize openly. She can make her daughter feel responsible simply by seeming wounded enough, disappointed enough, sad enough, abandoned enough. That dynamic can keep a daughter emotionally tethered for decades. Because how do I separate cleanly from someone I also feel sorry for? How do I set limits with a woman whose suffering I have spent my life registering? How do I stop over-functioning in a relationship where the other person's fragility has always felt more morally urgent than my own truth? These are not small questions. They go to the center of adult female identity. Especially because daughters raised like this often become women who are exquisitely trained in emotional responsibility. We know how to read pain. We know how to preempt it. We know how to make ourselves manageable around it. So when our mothers age, struggle, grow more dependent, or remain emotionally fixed in the same old patterns, the daughter may feel trapped all over again. Not because she lacks love. Because love has always been braided with guilt. That is what so few people understand. The difficulty is not simply my mother hurt me. The difficulty is my mother hurt me in ways that made me feel cruel for noticing. That is a very specific wound. A daughter like this often learns to distrust her own clarity because clarity feels disloyal. She keeps translating, excusing, smoothing, contextualizing, and minimizing. She becomes more articulate about her mother's pain than about her own. She becomes an expert in emotional nuance and still cannot say the plain sentence that would most honor her own experience. Being her daughter cost me something profound. Not because my mother did not care in any way. Not because she never sacrificed. Not because there was no goodness in her. But because goodness and emotional availability are not the same thing. Sacrifice and attunement are not the same thing. Softness and safety are not the same thing. A woman can be decent and still wound her daughter deeply if she cannot bear her daughter's truth, cannot celebrate her daughter's freedom, cannot protect her from harmful dynamics, and cannot separate her own unresolved suffering from the relationship she has with the child standing in front of her. This is the mother-daughter tension no one talks about because it asks for more complexity than most people can tolerate. It asks us to hold love and harm in the same hand. To admit that a mother may be sympathetic and still unsafe in certain emotional ways. To recognize that a daughter can ache for her mother and also need distance from the emotional gravity of her. To see that the deepest fracture is not always loud. Sometimes it is built from decades of subtle diminishment, emotional inconsistency, misdirected resentment, and the constant burden of being the person who must understand more than she was ever allowed to say. And perhaps the saddest part is that many daughters carry this tension in silence for years because silence feels more respectful than truth. But silence has a price. It keeps me confused. It keeps me waiting. It keeps me managing a relationship instead of grieving it honestly. And until I begin to tell the truth about that tension, I remain stuck inside the old role, the daughter who must keep loving carefully, speaking carefully, existing carefully, so that her mother never has to face what her passivity really cost. The life I built while not fully believing in myself. The life I built while not fully believing in myself did not look ruined from the outside. That is part of what made it so difficult to question. It looked respectable. It looked coherent. It looked like the kind of life people spend years trying to build. There were jobs, routines, responsibilities, relationships, obligations met on time, dinners made, calls returned, bills paid, holidays observed, a calendar full of evidence that I was functioning exactly as I should. If someone had asked me whether I was capable, I could have given them a long list of proof. If someone had asked whether I was dependable, no one who knew me would have hesitated. If someone had asked whether I had held a life together, the answer would have been yes. But those are not the same questions as these. Did I trust myself? Did I know how to listen to the part of me that went quiet when something was wrong? Did I know how to stop, turn inward, and believe what I found there? Did I know how to choose a life, rather than simply adapt to one? That is where the fracture lived. It is possible to build a very competent life while being only partially connected to the self who is living it. It is possible to become admired for stability while carrying a private and recurring sense that I am somehow not fully inside my own decisions. Not absent exactly. Not unconscious. But distanced. As if I had learned to participate in my life faithfully without always inhabiting it completely. That distance begins in small moments long before it becomes a pattern. It begins every time I feel a hesitation and dismiss it. Every time I sense a red flag and translate it into nerves. Every time a quiet no rises in me and I answer with a yes anyway because the no feels harder to justify. Every time I tell myself that discomfort is simply part of adulthood, that doubt is normal, that fear means I should keep moving forward rather than pause. When a woman has grown up without strong internal permission, she often becomes skilled at overriding herself in ways that look mature. She can marry while uncertain, commit while divided, stay while hollow, continue while grieving something she has not yet named. She can talk herself past her own instincts with astonishing sophistication. She can turn reluctance into gratitude, unease into loyalty, and emotional absence into a perfectly reasonable compromise. So the life gets built. Not always against my will. Not always in total blindness. But often with a low-grade estrangement from my own deeper knowing. I think that is what many women begin to understand in midlife when the noise finally lowers enough for the truth to become audible. Not that every decision was wrong. Not that everything was false. But that too much of life was built around manageability, acceptability, duty, or emotional survival, and not enough around conviction. Not enough around inner authority. Not enough around the sturdy, rooted feeling of I know this is mine. That is a painful realization because it changes the way I look back. Suddenly the milestones are still there, but the emotional meaning of them shifts. The engagement. The marriage. The job offer. The move. The second child. The years I remained. The years I stayed quiet. The years I told myself that something missing did not necessarily mean something was wrong. I begin to see how often I chose what I could sustain rather than what I could fully inhabit. That is not the same thing. There are women who can name the exact moment this realization arrived. For some, it comes after divorce. For others, it arrives during a quiet marriage that never technically collapses, but slowly becomes emotionally airless. For others, it comes after children leave home and the structure of care that once organized every day falls away, leaving enough silence for long-buried truths to rise. Sometimes it comes after a health scare, a betrayal, a death, a promotion that feels strangely empty, a birthday that lands harder than expected, or an ordinary evening when the house is still and there is no one left to manage for a few minutes. I think of Claire in Seattle, because her life helps me tell the truth about this. Claire is not reckless. She is not dramatic. She is not looking to burn her life down in order to feel something. She is 51, disciplined, intelligent, admired at work, the kind of woman people describe as steady. She remembers details, keeps things moving, follows through. She has spent years in healthcare administration, where competence is currency and emotional restraint is often mistaken for professionalism. She knows how to solve problems before they spread. She knows how to keep her voice level in a crisis. She knows how to carry more than should reasonably be hers. At home, the pattern is quieter but not unfamiliar. Her marriage has not exploded. There has been no singular scandal that would make the outside world nod in sympathy and say, of course. It is simply that she has spent years beside a man whose emotional range is narrow enough to leave her lonely and broad enough to keep her doubting whether loneliness is a fair complaint. He is not monstrous. He is not impossible. He is just emotionally underdeveloped, accustomed to her steadiness, and never forced by the marriage to grow very far beyond his own comfort. Claire has made this life work. That is exactly the problem. She has made it work so well that the cost of her adaptation has remained hidden even from herself. One rainy evening she sits in her parked car outside her house, hands still on the steering wheel long after the engine is off. The porch light is on. She can see the outline of the kitchen window, the room where she has made thousands of practical decisions, where dinners were prepared, lunches packed, homework supervised, hard days managed, holidays organized. She looks at the house and feels something she has no polished language for at first. Not panic. Not even despair. Just resistance. A deep resistance to walking back into a life that requires her to resume being the version of herself that everyone else knows how to use. And in that moment, something lands in her with a force that is almost physical. I do not know whether I have ever truly learned how to choose myself without first building a case against my own guilt. That is not a glamorous revelation. It will not fit on a coffee mug. It does not make anyone clap. But it is the kind of truth that can split a life into before and after, because once a woman sees that she has been negotiating against herself for years, she cannot return to innocence. This is what happens when self-trust has been quietly eroded over time. I do not mean confidence in the usual sense. Many women like this are highly competent. They know how to perform. They know how to deliver. They know how to manage. But confidence in performance is not the same thing as trust in perception. It is possible to be excellent in public and deeply uncertain in private. Possible to lead meetings, raise children, handle emergencies, support friends, pay mortgages, endure grief, and still not fully trust the small inner voice that says, "This matters, this hurts, this is not enough, this is not mine, this is costing too much." When a mother does not mirror a daughter's reality with steadiness, the daughter often grows into a woman who needs excessive evidence before she can believe herself. She waits, watches, double-checks, interprets, reinterprets, asks whether she is being fair, wonders if she is tired, hormonal, too demanding, too sensitive, too affected. She does not move quickly on behalf of her own truth because truth, in her original home, was never allowed to stand alone. It had to be filtered through other people's comfort first. That is why women like this can remain in lives that are only partially alive to them. Not because they are weak. Because the internal pathway between perception and action was never fully strengthened. I may know what I feel, but not trust it enough to reorganize my life around it. I may sense what is missing, but not believe absence is sufficient reason to stop. I may feel the ache clearly and still think I need permission from pain that is more dramatic before I can respond. And so whole identities get built around adaptation. The good wife. The capable mother. The reliable colleague. The understanding friend. The woman who can handle a lot. The woman who asks for very little. The woman who is endlessly reasonable. Underneath those identities, there may be an unasked question that shadows decades. What would my life have looked like if I had trusted myself earlier? That question can break a heart. Not because it comes with a clean answer. Because it reveals how much grief can be hidden inside a well-constructed life. It reveals the relationship I entered while doubting. The apology I gave when I should have paused. The job I accepted because it was secure, not because it was aligned. The conversations I swallowed. The versions of myself I suppressed because they would have complicated the arrangement. The years I spent calling it maturity when often it was fear. And yet I do not want to treat this realization as proof that my life was false. That would be too simple, and women like this have already suffered enough from simplistic readings of their own experience. The truth is more nuanced. Much of what I built may have been real, loving, sincere, and hard-won. But sincerity does not erase self-abandonment. Duty does not guarantee alignment. Stability does not always mean belonging. That is why midlife can feel so disorienting. Not because everything falls apart, but because the woman herself becomes less willing to remain divided. The old arrangement begins to fail. The self who was once edited for the sake of continuity begins to push forward. She becomes harder to hush. She appears in small moments first. In the exhaustion that feels different than ordinary fatigue. In the resentment that no longer dissolves. In the desire for solitude. In the inability to keep pretending that fine is a satisfying emotional category. In the sudden force of grief during entirely ordinary tasks. It may happen while folding laundry, driving home, standing at the sink, listening to a spouse talk without really hearing me, returning from work to a house that looks like mine but does not yet feel fully inhabited by me. It may happen with no witnesses at all. That privacy matters. Because so much of this reckoning takes place beneath the level of visible crisis. It is not a spectacle. It is not a breakdown in the dramatic sense. It is more like an internal refusal. A deep and slowly clarifying refusal to keep constructing a life around what I can tolerate rather than what I can deeply live inside. For some women, that truth leads to external change. A separation. A move. A different job. A new way of organizing the household. A long overdue boundary. A reordering of what counts as acceptable. For others, the life on the outside changes less dramatically, but the interior stance changes everything. They begin to stop volunteering themselves for emotional overuse. They stop translating emptiness into gratitude. They stop assuming that endurance is the same as integrity. What matters most is not the shape of the change. It is the return of belief. Not belief in perfection. Not belief in a magical second life untouched by loss. But belief in my own perception. My own response. My own right to register what something has felt like from the inside. That return is often slow because distrust of self is rarely repaired all at once. But even the beginning of it changes the atmosphere of a woman's life. She no longer needs 10 pieces of evidence to take one internal signal seriously. She no longer treats every discomfort as a character flaw. She no longer assumes that her role is to understand everyone else while remaining a mystery to herself. The life I built while not fully believing in myself may have looked successful. It may have looked stable. It may have impressed people. It may even have contained real love and real beauty. But if I had to keep doubting my own interior reality in order to sustain it, then some part of me was always paying. And eventually, the self keeps the receipt. What healing looks like when I'm no longer performing strength. Healing begins, for women like me, in a place that does not look impressive. It does not begin in triumph. It does not begin in a perfectly worded boundary, a bold new identity, or a dramatic exit from everything that has hurt me. Most of the time, it begins in the moment I can no longer confuse my coping with my character. It begins when I stop calling every adaptation a virtue simply because it helped me survive. It begins when I notice that what the world has often praised in me, my steadiness, my reliability, my ability to stay calm, to carry, to smooth, to endure, has also been the costume I wore while I slowly disappeared from myself. That is why healing can feel strangely undramatic at first. It is not an explosion. It is more like a return of signal. A faint inner sound that has been buried beneath obligation, performance, emotional management, and old loyalty patterns. For years, I may have lived as the woman who could handle things. The woman who knew how to be useful in a crisis. The woman who anticipated other people's needs before they had to ask. The woman who was admired for not being difficult. The woman whose pain rarely became public enough to inconvenience anyone. Healing begins when I stop mistaking that entire arrangement for wholeness. There is a difference between being strong and performing strength. Performed strength is often efficient, polished, and deeply lonely. It keeps the day moving. It protects image. It prevents collapse. It allows me to remain competent in spaces where I am not nourished. It helps me survive relationships that ask me to keep translating myself into something easier to live with. Performed strength says, I'm fine. I've got it. It's no problem. Don't worry about me. It sounds generous, mature, self-contained. But underneath it, there is often a woman who has been taught that visible need is dangerous, that emotional truth must be carefully portioned, that receiving care is uncertain but providing it is dependable. Lived strength feels different. It is less polished, less eager to impress, less available for self-erasure. It has a steadier pulse. It does not rush to prove how much it can tolerate. It does not turn pain into a personality trait. It does not equate over-functioning with dignity. Lived strength can pause. It can disappoint someone. It can leave a text unanswered until tomorrow. It can say, "That doesn't work for me," without writing a dissertation in apology. It can sit quietly with discomfort without automatically assuming that discomfort means I have done something wrong. That difference matters, because many women in midlife are not learning how to become stronger in the usual sense. We have already been strong, often far beyond what should have been required. What we are learning instead is how to stop performing in vulnerability. How to stop arranging our lives around a version of strength that made other people comfortable while keeping us emotionally unattended. For me, healing often begins with noticing rather than changing. Noticing is much harder than it sounds, because old patterns are so familiar they pass for instinct. I have to notice where I disappear in real time, where I rush to smooth, where I explain too much, where I smile before I know what I feel, where I say yes with a body that is already saying no, where I become immediately responsible for the emotional atmosphere of the room, where I begin taking care of another person's discomfort before I have acknowledged my own. That kind of noticing is intimate work. No applause comes with it. No one sees it when I catch myself about to over-accommodate and go quiet instead. No one sees it when I realize, halfway through a conversation, that I am performing ease rather than speaking honestly. No one sees it when I notice that what I call being understanding is sometimes fear of rupture in a prettier outfit. But these moments matter. They are how a woman begins to re-enter her own life. Healing also asks me to become less edited with myself. This may be one of the hardest parts. Many women raised by passive, emotionally unavailable mothers became highly skilled at emotional translation. We learned to turn sharp truths into softer ones. Anger became fatigue. Loneliness became busyness. Grief became productivity. Resentment became patience. We did not always lie. We refined. We civilized. We prepared our feelings for public consumption before we even admitted them to ourselves. Healing interrupts that process. It asks a more exact question: what am I actually feeling before I improve it for other people? Sometimes the answer is not flattering. Sometimes I am not merely tired. I am angry. Sometimes I am not merely overwhelmed. I am unseen. Sometimes I am not simply in a season. I am living with conditions that no longer fit the woman I am becoming. Sometimes what I need is not a better attitude or another routine. Sometimes I need to stop pretending that what hurts me only hurts a little. This is why grief becomes part of healing. Not the dramatic grief that others know how to recognize, but the quieter kind. The grief of finally admitting what I did not receive. The grief of realizing how long I have confused functionality with nourishment. The grief of understanding that I learned to make a home inside emotional scarcity and then called myself mature for surviving there. The grief of accepting that my mother may never become the kind of woman who can meet me cleanly, warmly, and without the old distortions. The grief of seeing how many years were spent waiting for forms of permission that never arrived. This grief is not self-indulgence. It is reality catching up with the body. When women like me do not grieve honestly, we often stay trapped in negotiation. We keep explaining. We keep minimizing. We keep telling the story in a way that protects everyone except the self who lived it. But grief ends certain negotiations. It does not make me hard. It makes me more accurate. It lets me stop pretending that enough can be made from what was consistently insufficient. It allows me to stop auditioning for care in places where care has always been partial. That is also why small practices matter so much. Not because they are trendy. Because healing for women like me is often built through ordinary acts of self-return. 10 quiet minutes at the end of the day without my phone, without television, without some other voice filling the room. Just enough silence to ask, what did I override today? Where did I leave myself? What hurt that I immediately minimized? What did my body know before my mind allowed it? These questions can change the texture of a life. Not overnight, but steadily. They begin to restore self-reference, which is something many of us were never fully allowed to develop. I may have been trained to notice everyone else before myself. Healing teaches me to reverse that order without becoming cruel. I can still care deeply. I can still be generous. But generosity that requires self-erasure is not love. It is old conditioning wearing a halo. Writing can become another form of return. Not polished writing. Not writing that performs insight. The kind that tells the truth without trying to sound wise. Letters I never send. Pages where I admit what I am still angry about. Sentences I would not say out loud yet. The story of what it was like to become the reasonable daughter, the reliable wife, the emotionally competent woman who was secretly starving for somewhere to put her full self. There is something powerful about seeing unedited truth in my own handwriting. It interrupts the old habit of making my experience smaller before I even acknowledge it. The body also becomes important in healing, especially for women who have spent years living from the neck up. A woman can become very articulate and still remain disconnected from her own physical signals. So healing may look like walking without a podcast, driving without calling anyone, sitting in a room without automatically tidying it, taking a long shower and noticing when I stop bracing, eating when I am hungry instead of when the schedule permits, resting before I am completely depleted, letting my shoulders drop, letting my face go soft, letting my nervous system experience moments that are not organized around vigilance. These things sound almost too simple, but that is because many women have been taught to overlook the intimacy of ordinary life. Healing does not only happen in major decisions. It happens in whether I pause before saying yes, whether I answer a question honestly instead of strategically, whether I allow a silence in conversation without rushing to fix it, whether I ask for help in a small matter and survive receiving it, whether I say no to an obligation that used to feel automatic, whether I choose the restaurant I actually want, the weekend I actually need, the room color I actually like, the pace my body can actually sustain. What changes most is not always the outside of the life. Sometimes it is the center of gravity inside it. A woman like Claire in Seattle may not leave her marriage tomorrow. She may not change careers this year. She may not make any outwardly dramatic move at all. But if she begins to stop performing the version of herself that everyone else finds easy to rely on, everything shifts. If she notices where she has been over-functioning and quietly withdraws from those reflexes, the emotional architecture of her life begins to change. If she allows herself to register loneliness without immediately excusing it, that matters. If she stops translating absence into gratitude, that matters. If she stops assuming that her role is to make every room more manageable, that matters. Healing does not always make life easier at first. In some ways, it makes life less efficient. Other people may feel the difference before I do. They may notice that I am slower to volunteer, harder to guilt, less responsive to emotional chaos, less willing to take the familiar role. That can unsettle systems built on my accommodation. But discomfort is not always a sign that healing is going wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply what truth feels like when it enters a room that was designed for silence. I think that is why mature healing has a different tone than the kind of inspirational language many women have already outgrown. It is not about reinvention as performance. It is not about becoming untouchable, endlessly confident, or spiritually above pain. It is not about winning. It is not about proving anything. It is about becoming more inhabitable to myself, more honest, more coherent, less divided between what I feel and what I allow myself to know. What healing looks like when I am no longer performing strength is not glamorous. It is quieter than that. It is me becoming someone I can remain with. Someone who does not abandon herself the moment tension appears. Someone who does not automatically convert need into shame. Someone who can tell the truth before resentment has to carry it. Someone who understands that softness is not the opposite of strength, and clarity is not the opposite of love. For a woman who has spent a lifetime being fine, that kind of healing can feel almost revolutionary. Not because it makes her louder, because it makes her real. There is a part of a woman's life that almost nobody prepares her for. It is not the beginning, when everything still feels open and unnamed. It is not the collapse, when pain becomes obvious enough that even the outside world has to admit something is wrong. It is the middle. The quiet middle. The place where I am still functioning, still showing up, still answering emails, still making dinner, still remembering birthdays, still paying bills, still driving where I need to drive, still sounding normal on the phone, still doing what responsible women do every day in this country without applause and often without witness. It is the place where my life still appears intact, and yet something inside me is no longer willing to keep calling this intactness peace. That is the middle. And it can feel so strange when I first arrive there, because there is often no dramatic event announcing it. No clean before and after. No single catastrophe I can point to and say, there. That is what changed me. Often, the middle begins when I simply cannot keep translating my own emptiness into patience. When I cannot keep calling loneliness maturity. When I cannot keep honoring every role in my life except the woman living underneath them. This is where many daughters of passive, emotionally unavailable mothers finally find themselves. Not necessarily broken. Not necessarily in crisis. Not necessarily ready to burn down the structures of their lives. Just unable to keep living at such a distance from themselves. That distinction matters to me, because women like this are often misread. If I am not falling apart publicly, people assume I am fine. If I am still competent, still employed, still married, still mothering, still pleasant, still productive, then the culture has very little language for my kind of suffering. A woman who is visibly shattered will at least be recognized as being in pain. But a woman who is functioning beautifully while quietly disappearing from herself can spend years being congratulated inside the very life that is wearing her out. That is one of the loneliest realities of the middle. I may be the woman everyone trusts. The woman everyone counts on. The woman who remembers, organizes, anticipates, stabilizes. The woman others describe as solid, thoughtful, grounded, gracious, resilient. And still, there may be an unlived part of me sitting just beneath the surface, waiting for me to stop calling survival enough. I think that is why this season can feel so emotionally disorienting. It is not only that I begin to see what was missing. It is that I begin to see how long I have been cooperating with that missingness. How long I have arranged myself around other people's comfort, limits, fragility, silence, underdevelopment, emotional laziness, or inability to meet me. How long I have confused being needed with being loved, composure with wholeness, endurance with wisdom. And yet I do not want to speak about this season as though it is only tragic. There is grief here, yes. There is regret. There is anger. There is the ache of looking back and realizing how much of my life was shaped by adaptation. But there is also something else here. Something quieter. Something almost sacred. There is honesty. The middle is often the first place where honesty is no longer optional. When I am younger, I can outrun myself more easily. There are deadlines, children, hormones, ambition, romance, the momentum of trying to build a life. There are reasons to postpone deeper reckonings. Reasons to keep moving. Reasons to stay busy enough that I do not have to hear the quieter truths rising underneath the noise. But in the middle, something changes. Time becomes more tangible. The cost of self-abandonment becomes harder to ignore. The body becomes less willing to absorb what the soul has been carrying for years. The old explanations stop working. The old distractions lose some of their power. The old role of being fine starts to feel emotionally expensive. And so I begin to ask better questions. Not how do I make this look okay? Not how do I stay grateful enough to silence myself? Not how do I keep everybody comfortable? But what has my life actually felt like from the inside? What am I still tolerating because it is familiar? What have I called normal simply because it resembles my original home? What would become possible if I stopped asking permission to feel what I feel? Those questions do not turn me into a different woman overnight. But they do make me a more truthful one. And truth, especially in the second half of life, has a different kind of beauty than performance. It is less polished, but more humane. Less eager to impress, but far more able to hold real intimacy. A woman in the middle may not glow with certainty. She may not know exactly what changes will come next. She may still be sorting through grief, boundary work, motherhood, marriage, divorce, caregiving, work fatigue, hormonal shifts, old family loyalties, and the emotional aftershocks of a childhood that taught her to disappear gracefully. But if she has started telling herself the truth, then something essential has already begun. I think about Claire in Seattle again. Not because her life is extraordinary in the dramatic sense, but because it is recognizable. She has spent years being competent enough to keep everyone from worrying. Years making herself reliable in rooms where reliability mattered more than emotional honesty. Years building a marriage, a career, a household, a schedule, a life that looks respectable from the outside. But now she is in the middle, and the middle is asking more of her than competence. It is asking for presence. It is asking whether she can remain emotionally absent from herself for another decade and still call that living. It is asking whether she wants to keep performing the version of herself that makes life run smoothly for everyone else. It is asking whether the woman beneath the roles will finally be allowed to have substance, texture, preference, sorrow, desire, clarity. That is what the middle asks of all of us, in one form or another. Not perfection. Not reinvention for the sake of spectacle. Not some gleaming fantasy of becoming untouched by grief. Just a deeper willingness to live without abandoning the self every time truth becomes inconvenient. This is why I resist the language of brokenness when I speak to women in this season. Brokenness suggests that the problem is located entirely inside me, as though I simply failed to be stronger, healthier, wiser, or more whole. But many women are not broken. Many women are carrying inheritance, conditioning, emotional training, old loyalties, survival skills that once made sense and now feel too small for the life they are trying to inhabit. To call that brokenness is too blunt, too shallow, too cruel. Sometimes I am not broken. Sometimes I am simply finally feeling the full weight of what it cost to become who I had to become. Sometimes I am not lost in the dramatic sense. Sometimes I am emerging from years of emotional over-adaptation, and emergence is messy. Sometimes I am grieving the mother I had, the marriage I accepted, the years I postponed myself, the tenderness I did not know how to ask for, the certainty I did not have access to sooner. Sometimes I am standing in the middle of a life that still works on paper and asking whether paper has ever once measured the human heart accurately. That question alone can change a woman. Because once I stop judging myself for being in the middle, I can begin to understand it differently. The middle is not only a place of confusion. It is also a place of reorganization. A place where old meanings loosen. A place where the performance of being fine starts losing its authority. A place where the hidden self begins pressing upward, asking not for applause, but for room. Room to speak plainly. Room to rest. Room to disappoint the old script. Room to stop being the emotional infrastructure of every relationship. Room to feel sadness without translating it immediately into gratitude. Room to let a marriage, a friendship, a family pattern, or a self-image be seen as it actually is. Room to become more inhabitable to myself. That is not a small thing. For some women, this season looks externally quiet. They remain in the same home, the same city, the same marriage, the same job, but with a new interior clarity that changes the entire atmosphere of their lives. For others, the middle becomes the bridge to visible change. A boundary. A separation. A move. A different pace. A different arrangement with family. A new solitude. A more honest way of mothering. A more exacting standard for what counts as love. But whatever shape it takes, the deepest movement is inward before it is outward. It is the movement from performance to presence. From explanation to truth. From managing myself for everyone else to finally asking what it means to remain with myself in a more faithful way. This is why I want to say, especially to the woman listening alone at night, maybe with headphones on, maybe after a long day, maybe while the rest of the house is quiet, maybe while she is wondering why she feels so full and so empty at the same time. I do not think your ache is trivial. I do not think your confusion means failure. I do not think your exhaustion is only about being busy. I do not think your longing is embarrassing. I do not think your late awakening makes it less real. I think some women arrive at the truest part of their lives slowly. I think some women need years before they can hear themselves clearly because they were raised to hear everyone else first. I think some women spend half a lifetime becoming competent enough to survive and only later begin to ask what it would mean to live. I think some women are not breaking down. They are breaking pattern. And that rarely looks glamorous from the inside. It often looks like grief, like slowness, like silence. Like a woman standing in her own life and no longer being able to pretend she is fully at home in arrangements that were built on her disappearance. That is not weakness. That is reckoning. And reckoning, however painful, has dignity in it. Because it means I am no longer willing to make a permanent home out of what once merely helped me endure. So no, I do not believe every woman in this place needs a new life overnight. I do not believe every ache requires a dramatic decision. I do not believe healing is a performance, or that clarity must arrive all at once. But I do believe this. There is something profoundly human, profoundly honorable, about a woman who stops lying to herself in the middle of her life. Even if her voice shakes. Even if she does not know the ending yet. Even if all she knows for now is that she cannot keep disappearing in such polished ways. That knowing is enough to begin. Not enough to finish. Not enough to solve everything. But enough to mark the moment where self-abandonment stops feeling noble and starts feeling unbearable. And sometimes, that is the real beginning. Not youth. Not certainty. Not reinvention. Just the quiet, unspectacular, deeply sacred moment when I stop asking whether I am broken and start understanding that I am living through the middle. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Before you go, I want to ask you a small question. Which feels more true for you right now? A. I've spent years looking fine on the outside while feeling emotionally far from myself. B. I'm only now starting to realize how much of my life was built around endurance. Comment A or B below. And if you have thoughts of your own, I would really like to hear them. What part of this felt closest to your experience? What do you think the quiet middle looks like in a woman's life? Share your perspective in the comments so other women reading can learn from it too. And if this kind of truth matters to you, subscribe to the channel and support it, so I can keep making the next honest, meaningful videos for women who have carried too much alone for far too long.